The first thing you need to know about natural selection is that it is not the same as evolution. Evolution is genetic change in a population over the generations. Natural selection is one mechanism, or it's one reason that a population can change genetically, but they aren't the same thing. A more complete definition of natural selection is that it is the differential survival and/or reproduction of organisms that differ in one or more characteristics. We'll unpack that as we go along. While the idea of biological evolution had in some way been present before Charles Darwin came along and revolutionized the biological world, natural selection was his really big idea. And it is by far the most interesting of the evolutionary mechanisms that we'll be learning about, or at least that's how most biologists think of it. It was a powerful idea because natural selection is the mechanism that can really fit organisms to their environment. And it generates the traits that we see in organisms that strike us as being most impressive. Whether it's the way that organisms blend in with their environment, the way they tolerate environmental extremes, the remarkable mechanisms that they have, almost machine-like mechanisms in some cases, that they use to do the things they need to do in order to survive. There are three things that must be true in order for a population to evolve by natural selection. One is that there has to be variation in a population. That is, there has to be some phenotypic trait, whether it's an organism's appearance or its behavior, for which some of the individuals in the population are different from others. Fortunately, if you look closely enough at organisms in wild, you'll find that they really do vary a lot from one another in all sorts of different characteristics. Almost any trait that you look at in wild organisms, you'll find some kind of phenotypic variation. The second requirement is that the variation needs to be heritable, at least in part. Organisms need to look at least somewhat like their parents. And fortunately, this also tends to be true. Organisms do tend to have the phenotypes that their parents had, if not the exact same ones. The third requirement for evolution by natural selection is that the variation needs to matter. And what I mean by matter is something like this. Here is maybe the ancient African plains. There are these giraffe-like organisms wandering around with relatively short necks. And let's suppose that during a drought, the leaves get eaten off of all the short trees, and so the only food that is still available is the leaves that are on the tall trees. If this is the case, it's possible that the shorter giraffes will starve to death. That's a difference in survivorship. It's possible that nobody will starve to death, but maybe just that the taller giraffes will get more food and so they're able to have more offspring. Either way, what you have is a difference in fitness. Fitness is one of these terms that can be misunderstood. Particularly, the phrase survival of the fittest is out there in popular culture. And even Darwin really disliked this phrase. Survival of the fittest can lead to misconceptions. It's a phrase that can lead to misconceptions about how natural selection works, because it's not just about survival. In order to pass on genes, you need to survive and reproduce. And this can lead to some pretty counterintuitive things. So for example, the redback spider has a very interesting mating behavior. The male, when he goes to mate with the female, he places a packet of sperm at the entrance to her genital opening. He's in black here. He's much, much smaller than the female is here. But after he places that packet of sperm at the opening to her reproductive tract, he does this sort of somersault right onto her jaws, which are poisonous, and she happily sucks him dry of his bodily fluids while she is engaged in reproducing with him. This does not seem like the sort of thing that natural selection would favor. But what's happening here is the reproduction of the fittest, if not the survival. Male redback spiders that allow themselves to be eaten by their mates during sex father a lot more of those females' offspring. And so even though they don't survive, they pass on more copies of their genes than individuals that escaped being eaten by their mates. Another misconception that you often see about fitness is it does not mean the same thing as physical fitness. We're not talking about strength, we're not talking about endurance, we're not talking about anything that you go to the gym to work on. Fitness in evolutionary biology means how many offspring does an organism leave behind. And generally what we do is we talk about the fitness of different genotypes. On average, for example, A1A1 individuals might leave behind 3 offspring. So it's an average for a particular genotype. The average for A1A2 individuals might be 2.8, and let's say that the average for A2 individuals is 2. That would be their fitnesses of those 3 genotypes. An important thing to keep in mind about fitness is it very often depends on context. These are 2 color morphs of a particular stick insect that's found in California, and it feeds on 2 different plants. These 2 color morphs have different fitnesses, but the fitness really depends on which plant you're on. On this plant, which has these white lines on the leaves, this color morph with the white lines on its back has a higher fitness. But on this plant over here where there aren't any white lines, this white line morph stands out, and so it has a lower fitness. Fitness is almost always dependent in some way on the ecological context in which an organism finds itself.